is it really requires moving policy, and by that I mean all sorts of policies, so city level, regional, national, the commission level, and then how we think of all the different instruments, away from one that is just about fixing things, so fixing market failures, whether those failures come from positive externalities like public goods, basic research, negative externalities, pollution where you need a carbon tax, information asymmetries, SME financing. This notion that you're just coming in to fix a market failure is not very useful if we want to think about innovation-driven, mission-oriented growth, okay? And what we require, I think, is something else, and I've stripped my slides down from the usual 60 to about 10, and the 10 are just about the mission, so forgive me if I rant a bit before I show you any slide. It's probably good anyway, is a market co-creation and co-shaping framework, where you have public, private, increasingly third sector actors, and also civil society. We should not forget civil society. People use that word, but you know, civil society has had a huge effect on markets. Just think of the fact we have weekends, right, and 8-hour workdays. People fought for that, mainly, not only in trade unions, right? That actually helped shape markets. So markets are outcomes of the interactions between public, private, third sector, and civil society, and how to sort of use that understanding to rethink what that means about the public bit, which is basically public policy, in terms of co-creating and co-shaping markets, but also value. I just wrote a book on value, which is, you know, that to really understand public value, we also have to understand how the public, meaning different actors, co-create that value. Anyway, I think that's actually useful for thinking about missions, because both how we decide which mission. Is it going to be just a Kennedy moonshot decision, one guy and his friends in government decide for everyone else, go to the moon and back again in one generation, as inspirational as that was really top down? Or is it something more similar to what happened in Germany recently, where a mission that really has driven production, distribution, and consumption in Germany through the Energiewende mission actually came, how it was framed also came from civil society movements, where for decades there was a green movement, not just a green party, a green movement, which brought legitimacy to having such a ambition. Forget whether it's good or bad. We all know that Energiewende has had problems. Any mission will have problems. But how we frame the mission, who is it? Is it one minister or president and their elite group, or how do we actually really engage civil society? So I think this is a big question, and one of the follow-ups that we will be doing actually with the Commission, we were just talking about it today with Catalyst, we'll see exactly how this pans out, but is actually really to look at the implementation issue, both in terms of how missions are selected, but also then how to govern them. Do we actually have at the member state level the capacity and the capability within the public institutions to think in this mission-oriented way, which means to be bold, to welcome risk and uncertainty, not to fear it, to talk about different types of instruments which can really crowd in the private sector in terms of co-investing, really sharing risks, not just de-risking. And this is, again, one of the issues that so much of the vocabulary that we have in public policy is kind of boring, right? So why don't we think of missions as a way to literally rethink that vocabulary? So instead of just de-risking the private sector, instead of just enabling it, instead of just fixing market failures, instead of just leveling the playing field, again, I'm almost falling asleep saying these words, or lender of last resort, right? Investor of first resort. Co-investing, that's what missions need, co-investing, not just lending of last resort kind of mentality, not just de-risking, sharing those risks. So in this report, which was written actually quite quickly in some ways with an urgency of, hey, we need to change course, and how can we use this mission-oriented approach to do that? What I tried to do with, obviously, the whole team that helped out in Catalyst's DG was to really kind of ask oneself, well, what can we learn from that moonshot mission, right? Which was purely technological, when so many of the challenges we have in front of us are obviously social, political, they require also regulatory challenges. They have regulatory challenges. And there are lessons, there are really interesting lessons that then when we apply them to these more so-called wicked problems, it's quite interesting. Because if you think of what the moonshot was, first of all, it was addressing a challenge, right? The challenge at the time was the space race, or just call it Sputnik. Had they just said, we're going to win the space race, they would not have gotten to the moon. They framed it in very concrete ways. Get to the moon and back again within a generation. So starting with the SDGs, or with the challenges that the Commission has been talking about for many years now, this is not new to talk about challenges, but really thinking through how can we frame it in a similar way, which is ambitious, bold, that gets people excited. Just think of what happened to kids in school. They, got re-energized in terms of the STEM subjects, and lots of different actors in society kind of felt, wow, this is important. There's a really great letter, by the way, by a nun, a Buddhist nun, who wrote to the head of NASA at the time, who said, what are you doing? There's poverty on Earth. Why are you spending these billions to go to the moon? And his response was fantastic in terms of looking and explaining in a very modest way, not condescending, how so many of the solutions actually on Earth that have helped to solve some of the big problems, whether it's health or hygiene, have actually often come from these spillovers of having these kind of, moonshot type missions. Anyway, so you start with the challenge, which in that case was Sputnik and the space race. You transform it into a mission. And then there's a layer there, sorry, that should have been there, which I'll show you in an example in a second. A mission that requires many different actors and sectors to solve. Right? So getting to the moon was not just aeronautics. It was also textiles. Textiles had to innovate. You couldn't get there in jeans and a T-shirt. And if you list all the different sectors that had to invest and innovate, there was about 13 or 14. A friend of mine listed them for me. And then the projects, hundreds, of which many failed. So the instruments that are then required to really foster and nurture that bottom-up experimentation and exploration are really important. We know that the Soviet system didn't work because it was too linear. It was top-down. The Soviets, of course, were spending lots on R&D, more than in many other countries like Japan, but Japan had much more of a system of innovation, right? There's that whole literature that we all know on national systems, regional systems of innovation, those horizontal linkages. Well, precisely the instruments can be designed in such a way to really foster both the linkages in terms of the collaborations between sectors, but especially how to nurture and sort of crowd in different types of ideas, of which many might fail, right? So again, that willingness to explore, experiment, and to focus almost as much on the spillovers from that experimentation process as on whether you actually achieve the mission or not. And so the examples that we came up with, which were purely exemplary, how do you say, examples to kind of tease out what the difficulties are, I thought were quite useful because they all, again, start out with really ambitious challenges, transform them into very concrete missions, link up all the different sectors. So getting plastic out of the ocean requires innovation in waste management, biotech, social, design, chemicals, marine, AI, and then again, lots of different types of projects. This framework, by the way, is incredibly useful almost on any kind of problem. I mean, London, where I'm living, has just experienced a huge wave of killings amongst teenagers, 17 to 20-year-old boys being knifed to death. And you can either look at that as just, a policing issue. Let's bring in, more investment in policing and stop and searches, et cetera. Or you could really look at it if you put, reducing inner city crime up top and then making the mission 0 17 to 20-year-old boys in London, obviously girls, but they're not dying, are going to die within the next 3 or 4 years. Whatever, frame it in such a way that it's very concrete. The kinds of investments you would require, so instead of talking about spending and just thinking it's going to be a charitable contribution or the cost of it, you think of it as an investment challenge, we started to use this approach to tackle that. And it was really interesting. It changed the lens. So all the different sectors and then the bottom-up different types of city-level projects that could really help Sadiq Khan, in this case, go after that mission. Anyway, so going through these examples for us was really a question of just teasing out what the issues are. So there was one around climate change, 100 carbon-neutral cities by 2030, that other one on the clean oceans, and one more related to health and well-being on decreasing the burden of dementia, things like how do you actually allow people with Alzheimer's to be really independent at home, and all the different, again, experimentation, exploration that would be required there. So let me just finish with, and then what the report did was, again, in a very simplistic way. I mean, this is when the work begins, when one starts to get their hands dirty with real missions. In the Commission, I think, will start to sort of get at that point by the end of this year of working with lots of different types of stakeholders to really come up with these missions. But the idea of, it actually matters to be quite clear on what the criteria are. Otherwise, it becomes very quickly a confusion between this category of a challenge, a mission, and then the projects. So for example, Herman, I know that you're very interested in quantum computing. For me, but maybe I'm wrong. I mean, this is an open discussion. Quantum computing is sort of at the project level, things that have to be financed. And in fact, the internet itself, in some ways, was a spillover, absolutely was a spillover of projects that were actually based on achieving a very particular type of goal and problem to be achieved. And so it has to be bold, address societal value, but who decides what's valuable in society? Well, that's exactly where we need stakeholder engagement to talk about things. So if we are going to look at care-related missions, we better have nursing organizations in the room with the commissioners thinking about how can we really devise an interesting mission around care for the aged. Concrete targets, so you actually know when you got there. That's exactly what defines a mission versus a challenge. Did you get to the moon and back again or not? They wouldn't have been able to ask that if it was just the space race or, again, climate change. Too vague, but very useful in terms of a focusing device. Involving research and innovation, technological readiness over a limited time frame, so not ad infinitum. And this one, I think, is one of the most important because you don't want to think of missions that literally just one actor or one sector could solve. So how you frame the mission, for example, a cancer mission, so it really requires lots of different types of sectors on the preventative side is extremely important, but that's going to drive how you actually frame that particular type of cancer mission versus seeing it just as a health and kind of a drugs, health-related solution. Cross-actor, cross-disciplinary. That's also very important, by the way. This is not just about the STEM subject. Social sciences, humanities, artists are very important, I think, in terms of how we frame these missions in an open, interesting, dynamic way that really foster new conversations that were not being had before. Additionality, making things happen that weren't happening already. This is very important, by the way, because the last thing we want is missions to be used just to define what people were already doing, whether it's a particular thing in the commission, the FETs, whether it's a particular sector that was doing something interesting and now they're going to call it a mission. We know that this happens all the time. And in fact, one of the drivers of doing a mission-oriented approach was precisely to reduce the risk of capture, whether it's academics capturing public policies in terms of saying how important their research is, or sectors saying, give me money, life sciences, give me more money. To do what, right? So using missions to really drive these new forms of collaborations. And this issue of multiple competing solutions. So then if you look at the issues around implementation that the report talks about, I've already sort of mentioned these, but who decides? How do we get the targets and milestones, which both allow long-termism, because you shouldn't choose a mission that you can solve in 1 year. That by definition is not really a mission. It's not going to drive sort of long-term innovation-led growth. But also along the way, kind of know whether you're kind of even closer or not. So you can also decide when to turn the tap off. One of the key things in DARPA and ARPA-E, classic mission-oriented organizations, was that they were just as conscious of when to turn the tap off as when to turn it on. And how they did that, we can learn a lot from those types of management, portfolio management, again, DARPA style, which means take risks, but also, fund it through a portfolio. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. If you have Energiewende and you just do offshore wind, that's not a very good way to think of a portfolio-driven mission approach around renewable energy. Flexibility, adaptability, to know when to pivot, when perhaps maybe you've framed that mission wrongly. How might we actually make sure that that adaptability and flexibility is part of the implementation criteria? Accountability, connecting, engaging citizens. In this last one, which I just want to finish with one more minute, is are we sure we even have the capacity and the capabilities and the dynamism and the talent within public institutions, both within the Commission, but especially at the member state level? And this is what I was saying before, that I think, unfortunately, precisely this language that you're just there to fix a market failure, to enable, to de-risk, hasn't actually helped incentivize the kinds of investments within the public sector that are required when instead you see yourself also alongside businesses co-creating value. And so what's interesting is, again, looking at, and I think this is a really important next step, looking at actual mission-oriented organizations around the world that define themselves not just as fixing markets, but really having missions within their little space. So this is at the organizational level. understanding also how they were structured. So when I asked Cheryl Martin, who was the second director of ARPA-E, which is probably one of the most ambitious and innovative public organizations that has thought about different missions around energy, she said, well, you know, how we actually even organize ourselves is very much based on whether we are taking enough risks. We evaluate our processes, our implementation procedure, on whether we took enough risks, because if we didn't, what's the point? And how much impact our successes had. And I don't know if you know, but they're one of the biggest innovators around battery storage. But again, learning how do they attract talent, how do they get people within to kind of be a bit hungry and foolish, because you know, one of the big questions the Commission will have to answer is, are there going to be leaders? Are there going to be boards? Will there be an organization kind of leading, you know, every particular mission, so that you do also have an easier process of accountability and measurement along the way? Who's doing the measurement? Under what regime and time period? So changing the words, this is from these postcards I made in my institute, but really I think we should really use this as an opportunity for Europe to rethink itself, to kind of get happy, right? Because we are a bit depressed given what's happening across Europe. To use the missions to change the vocabulary through which we talk about what the speaker here before was talking about in terms of co-creation. And there's very different questions. I don't have time to go into this, but you can read it in a working paper we have on the Institute website, which kind of goes into details on what the questions are specifically for policymakers when they ask themselves, you know, if they're going to have a mission-oriented program, what does it mean for the kind of, again, capacities and capabilities to turn your organization into a learning organization that learns from failure, because that will be necessary. And that's it.
Okay,
yep.
Good. Thank you.